Dear former students, dear former colleagues at the St. Petersburg State University, dear fellow German citizens, dear compatriots in Russia, dear friends, and everyone who is listening to my lecture. The current situation with Russia and Europe forces me to speak again about the integration of Russia in Europe in the third part of my lecture on this subject. As you remember, at the end of the second part of my lecture, my final lecture at the State University in St. Petersburg in 2016, 2 years after the occupation of Crimea by the instruction of the leadership layer of Russia, I addressed the then and current President of Russia with the quote from Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian president, and asked the President of Russia to internalize this statement. I would go to the end of the earth if I could thereby avoid the death of a single soldier, said Anwar Sadat. I also suggested to the President of Russia to go to Brussels and initiate the end of the East-West conflict with the integration of Russia into Europe. In view of today's situation in August 2023, with numerous fallen soldiers from Russia in Ukraine, and Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, including numerous children, I think that back in 2016 I feared, respectively, foresaw the current situation in Russia and Europe. Yes, this development was the most likely scenario I considered. If you remember, I said in my lecture back then that I would say the same thing in Berlin and in St. Petersburg. However, with the restriction that, or I say nothing at all. That concerned St. Petersburg. I am now removing this restriction because the current situation in Europe requires it. I now say my opinion on all topics and everywhere. That is why this third lecture, my third lecture, is addressed first of all to the people of Russia and separately also to the leadership layer of Russia. Here you can see the countries and the periods in which I have lived and worked. In the first part of my lecture, I said a lot about myself autobiographically and mainly reported on the wonderful 22 years in St. Petersburg as a university lecturer at the State University of St. Petersburg. And I listed 3 countries with which I have an emotional connection or with which I feel I belong: Hungary, Germany, and Russia. But who am I? A Hungarian, a German, or a Russian? So how do I really feel, you might ask me? My answer: according to my upbringing and experience, I am a European. And that includes the 3 countries listed, including Russia. And today, in Europe, I see a striking parallel between what happened before World War II and the current situation. And that is the main reason why I decided to give this lecture. The parallel concerns the policy of appeasement. Most of my German fellow citizens know the Munich Agreement, which was intended to appease Germany in the 1930s by granting large areas of Europe. It did not help. The mania of attack, when the decisions are in the hands of a narrow leadership layer of the state, is only intensified. In the end, after the annexation of Austria, after the Sudetenland, Bohemia, Moravia, and Poland, was the attack on the Soviet Union and the Allied victory over Germany after a devastating World War II. This is now developing in a similar way in the case of Russia. First South Ossetia, then Abkhazia, then Crimea, then Donbass, and finally attack on Ukraine. An allied structure of states was only formed in the case of the Ukraine, which puts a stop to the aggression of the leadership layer of Russia. The heroic resistance of the Ukrainians is the most important element in the emergence of this alliance, which the leadership layer of Russia labels the collective West. I am aware that many members of the leadership layer of Russia are just followers, especially after the latest external aggression and the tightening of domestic policy. Here a question of definition. By the leadership layer of Russia, I understand the state apparatus, including the president and immediate to middle administrative environment, State Duma, that is the Russian parliament, and administration, and state administration with influence on the decisions of the aforementioned administrative structures. And this attack on Ukraine came after the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, where the leadership layer of Russia pledged to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity. It is to be noted, the leadership layer of Russia first gives Ukraine a guarantee of territorial integrity, so that Ukraine unilaterally renounces nuclear weapons, and then parts of Ukraine are occupied. This is a style of bargaining at a weekly market. Against any agreement, one can lie that the situation has changed, which is what the leadership layer of Russia is doing now. For me, this means that no negotiations will help against the aggression of the leadership layer of Russia against Europe. Only strength and resistance. By no means do I mean that the Europeans should attack Russia. But they should have the capacity, if they don't have it, then create or build it up to stop the leadership layer of Russia at the common border. At least until the current leadership layer of Russia persists. Because the openly declared goal of the leadership layer of Russia are we in Western Europe. I experienced this almost daily during my stay in St. Petersburg for 22 years and since 2016 until today in the mass media of Russia. Namely, the military victory over the USA and Western Europe and the creation of a new world order under the sole guidance of the leadership layer of Russia. Characteristic of the intentions of the leadership layer of Russia is the victory message, in quotation marks, on Russian state television 3 days after the attack on Ukraine. A slideshow, as the leadership layer of Russia puts it with the term special war operation, and arrests any protesting person who calls this a war, with a poster on the street. The text reads as follows: "A new world is being born before our eyes. Russia's war operation in the Ukraine heralds a new era. Russia is restoring its unity. The tragedy of 1991, that terrible catastrophe of our history, its unnatural distortion is over. Russia is restoring its historical holiness, gathering the Russian world, the Russian people, in their entirety, of Great Russians, Belarusians, and Little Russians." And the text goes on that the President of Russia has, without a shred of exaggeration, accepted a historical responsibility by deciding not to leave the solution of the Ukrainian questions to the future generations. This victory message disappeared from the screen after a short time. My Russian friend in Germany said when I sent him the declaration, "It reads like Mein Kampf." This sheet must make us aware, dear compatriots in Russia and dear German fellow citizens, where this leadership layer of Russia is slipping and where it is already on the way there. As characteristic of the daily propaganda, I bring only a televised appearance of Vladimir Zhirinovsky in a prime-time debate on state television. Zhirinovsky was a party leader in Russia. His party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, LDPR, is a nationalist populist party and is represented in the State Duma, the Parliament of Russia. The party's share in various legislative periods was between 8 and 22%. For my German fellow citizens, I would like to point out, please note that these statements were made on state television in a discussion round during prime time, like in Germany on ZDF or ARD. Zhirinovsky made the following statement: "Rise, giant country, rise for mortal combat, with the dark NATO power, with the cursed horde. We will win in this our last war with NATO. We remain the only power in this world, superpower. War, we have that together for you for complete destruction. Ukraine will not exist at all. Forget the word Ukraine. There will be no Moldova, no Baltic. We are still thinking about Caucasus. We are still thinking about Central Asia. People will respect us. The whole world will be on its knees before us. Half Britain, half America will not exist. The rest of the world can stay. Only London will be destroyed. Yes, Washington and Chicago, do you understand? But you must do it more quickly. military solution, war, complete. Millions will die there. There will be destruction. Everything will burn there. From this nuclear dust on European American soil, another civilization is finally emerging under the leadership of Russia. Zhirinovsky died in 2022 at the end of the COVID period. The current president of Russia attended his funeral. A postage stamp with Zhirinovsky is planned in Russia. My compatriots in Russia are used to such statements on state television. My German fellow citizens probably still have to internalize that such propaganda agitation is even allowed or operated by the leadership layer of Russia. It testifies to the attitude and intention of the contemporary leadership layer of Russia. But please do not confuse this with the population of Russia as a whole. This was the time immediately before the leadership layer of Russia attacked Ukraine. But let us return to my time in St. Petersburg as the starting point of what I want to say. Very soon, during my stay and work from 1993 at the State University of St. Petersburg, I concluded that the leadership layer of Russia has three alternatives for the further development of Russia. The first was the introduction of Western-style democracy. What was expected from the West. The second was the establishment of a totalitarian regime. The third was the integration of Russia in Europe, which I then publicly propagated in my lecture 2016. Already the approach to a democracy with the Perestroika and Glasnost by Gorbachev led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union, Russia is a multi-ethnic country. The 85 subjects of the Federation are partly organized according to ethnically populated regions. The leadership layer of Russia has unwantedly already pre-designed the possible breaking points for the disintegration of Russia by creating 8 supra-regional administrative entities such as the Far Eastern Federal Territory, for example. This would be the continuation of the rupture process that began in 1867 with the sale of Alaska to the United States. In 1917, at the second rupture, Russia lost the territory of Finland and Poland, and temporarily, until the establishment of the Soviet Union, the territory of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. While the Western colonial powers continuously gave up their colonies in the 20th century, Russia's third rupture dates to December 26, 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Soviet republics, which were structured according to national principles, split off. Of course, there is a key difference between Russia and the Western colonial powers in this regard. As with Russia, this was an area related to the motherland. Now, the 85 subjects of the Federation continue to be largely structured according to national or ethnic principles, as was the case in the former Soviet Union. But here is my unequivocal statement. I am in favor of keeping Russia within the current borders, until Russia turns into a country that even former Soviet republics want to associate with the country. This means that not 100,000 inhabitants flee from Russia, but as in the case of the United States, for example, 10,000 migrate there every year or try to enter the country illegally. It is up to us in Russia to achieve this. This is also my argument against the envious anti-Americanism in Russia fueled by the leadership layer of Russia. This comparison alone invalidates the propaganda of the leadership layer of Russia. It is clear that USA is a better country for people than today's Russia. People vote with their feet. End of discussion. The second alternative of the leadership layer of Russia was the establishment of a totalitarian regime. And it was chosen by the leadership layer of Russia from the year 2000 onwards. In particular, the welding of the nation that has been going on in Russia for 20 years by fomenting a common image of the enemy, namely the West, and the declared goal of creating world domination under the sole guidance of the leadership layer of Russia. Dear German citizens, the latter may seem very odd to some of you, given the current political bankruptcy of the leadership layer of Russia. But I assure you that this is the official approach propagated in the mass media in Russia. The third alternative for the leadership layer of Russia that I mentioned in 2016 was Russia's integration into Europe. This was the suggestion of my final lecture at the State University in St. Petersburg, and I reiterate my position now. Many of my conversation participants today believe that this is impossible in the current situation created by Russia's attack on Ukraine. My opinion is now more than ever. But in what way? The reciprocal state Germany-Russia was my absurd proposal for the integration of Russia into Europe in the second part of my lecture. But as Albert Einstein said, if an idea doesn't seem absurd at first, there is no hope for it. But there are certainly weakened variants of the reciprocal state that would be accepted by both sides. But I cannot deal with this in the context of this lecture. Instead, I ask the question, what other statements did my lecture from back then contain, and what have I done since then to reinforce my statements? Because this presentation is the continuation of my lecture at the University of St. Petersburg, it is important to list the statements from that time as a starting point. First was the statement that Russia is not a superpower. This was the statement made by Professor Erich Klinkmüller, head of the economics department of the Eastern Europe Institute at the Free University of Berlin in 1986, 5 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2016, I took over this statement and adopted it to the situation in Russia. The economic capacity of Russia is smaller than the economic capacity of Italy. Let's imagine that in terms of economic size, a medium-sized European country would launch a military attack against the community of states of the NATO, G7, and the free world altogether. For example, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, and the USA. At around 140 million, Russia's population is significantly less than twice the population of Germany. The population of the Allied community of states is 500 million. That means 500 million. How ailing the decision-making structures of the leadership layer of Russia must be. How far away their parallel world must be from our reality. But here I have already anticipated the second point. The second point was the warning that on sanctions Russia faces a strong community of states with the economic balance of power being 4% to 96% against Russia. The third point was the proposal to the President of Russia to integrate Russia into Europe. Russia's share of the European economy would be 9%. And this community of states would be the strongest economic entity in the world. My suggestion still applies. The fourth point was the warning to the President of Russia in the summer of 2016 that if the leadership layer of Russia continued the aggressive policy pursued, there would be a risk of countless fallen Russian soldiers. Unfortunately, this happened, and we do not want to forget the numerous Ukrainian civilians, children, and soldiers. My final lecture was listed on the homepage of the economics faculty in St. Petersburg for years before it no longer appeared after the homepage was redesigned. And what did I do after I finished teaching in St. Petersburg? What were my activities after my lecture, that means after 2016? Here is a chronological list. First, I translated my final lecture into 3 more languages and put it on YouTube. I also shared them on Facebook. To date, there are unfortunately only about 6,000 views. I also put the lectures on Russia's platform RuTube, which is equivalent to YouTube. The number of views is unfortunately only 36. Also, I put the lectures in 4 languages on Russia's platform Vkontakte, corresponding to Facebook. The result is again only a meager 118 views. In Vkontakte, however, I also posted something else, and the number of views on this video reached almost 11,000. It is about my trip to Bashkiria in Russia together with my cousin. We searched, unfortunately in vain, for the grave of our grandfather who died there in the Soviet labor camp in 1953. We received a lot of support from the Bashkirian people, and the local TV station took an interview from us. I put it in Vkontakte, and the number of views, as I said, reached almost 11,000. My other activities were initially contacts to the Bundestag, the German parliament in Berlin, to a specific member of the Bundestag, and to the Embassy of Russia in Berlin, to specific embassy employees for the purpose of establishing of 2 integration parties. These were talks I initiated on the creation of 2 independent political parties in Russia and Germany with the aim of integrating Russia into Europe. 2 so-called integration double parties. The activities of both parties would have been the agitation of the integration of Russia in Europe, with all legally permitted means, and contribution to the corresponding political decision-making in their own country. Unfortunately, after a certain time, after obviously consulting the responsible authorities in Russia, the information came from the Embassy of Russia in Berlin that the embassy was not the right institution for this project. Therefore, because I did not want to act as an opposition in Russia, I stopped my efforts in this regard. I also communicated this plan in a letter to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel at the beginning of August 2016. I got this reply. You suggest that the Federal Republic should carry out an experiment together with the Russian Federation as a mutual reciprocal state. Your proposal currently has very little chance of being implemented, not only because of Russia's behavior in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. But thank you for your suggestion. Your proposal was read with interest. Finally, in 2022, after Russia's attack on Ukraine, I wrote a letter to the President of Russia. In it, I repeated my initiative in the second part of my lecture in St. Petersburg from 2016 for a reciprocal state Germany-Russia and his trip to Brussels and expressed my great concern for Russia. Here are excerpts from the letter. I am convinced that such an initiative in the current geopolitical situation would be largely welcomed in Germany. If my suggestion may have seemed illusory earlier, now, with the changes that are about to take place in Russia, it would be a starting point for your entry into world history as a positive statesman who can change the geopolitical situation for the better. Above all, your initiative would lead to maintaining the integrity and deserved role of Russia in a united Europe and to economic prosperity in the country. I am very worried about Russia. I received an answer in the tone similar to that of the German Chancellor. We have received your letter to the President of the Russian Federation. We appreciate your active civic position and wish you the very best. And now I publish the third part of my lecture with my clear position on the attack on Ukraine. But one more remark beforehand. I am not talking about Russians, I am talking about people of Russia. This term was coined by the former president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, and I think that's right. My rationale is about 20% of the Russian population is officially not of Russian ethnicity. My rough estimate is that over 50% of the population in Russia is partially considered not Russian, whether through marriage or mixed ethnicity or family ties. To lump all this together and simply talk about Russians is strange to me, simply not in accordance with the facts. People of Russia is the correct term that unites all these people. A very strong commonality is, of course, the common Russian language. One has to get used to it, but here I will talk about people of Russia. You have probably already noticed that I make a distinction between Russia and the leadership layer of Russia. In totalitarian state in particular, one must not speak about a country as a whole, because that suggests that the population is acting there or that actions are being taken with the consent of the population. That may be the case in a democratically functioning society, but not in a totalitarian system. In the latter, a narrow leadership layer decides and directs the actions of the state as a whole. And I have to say that in recent history, there are no examples of this leading to a good ending. What do I want to say about the current situation in Russia? When the current president took office in the year 2000, there was a turnaround back towards the Soviet Union, least as far as the propaganda and the self-image of the state of Russia by the leadership layer of Russia itself is concerned. The first action in this direction after the then and current President of Russia took office in the year 2000 was the abolition of the free press through nationalization and other methods of subordination. Further signs of his future intentions and preparations after taking office in 2000 were a flight in a fighter jet and a ride in a combat submarine. Furthermore, I will now present some examples of propaganda that were expanded after the year 2000 by the then and current leadership layer of Russia and are still being practiced today. The areas listed are not complete. I present the areas whose omission seems to me to be the most urgent measure for the acceptance of Russia in the European Community of States. And the first is the preparation of the people of Russia for war. Regarding propaganda, there are some striking parallels between what George Orwell said in the 1940s and what is happening in contemporary Russia. Orwell was heavily influenced by the political events and totalitarian regimes of his time. These were in particular the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, the National Socialist Germany under Adolf Hitler, and the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. George Orwell treated the conditions in a dystopian society. I will return to his statements more often in the context of this topic because I found confirmation of this in the actions of the leadership layer of Russia. For example, wars are waged by making people believe they need to be defended. The truth is often falsified or veiled in order to shape the desired public opinion. My second example of propaganda from the leadership layer of Russia is the spread of the view that if you are against the government and president of Russia, then you are against Russia as a state and nation. This is the suppression of any opposition and bringing the legislature and judiciary into line with the actions and projects of the leadership layer of Russia. The result is unanimous votes in the State Duma, the parliament of Russia, and corresponding judicial decisions. On this point, the superpower mania, I have already expressed myself sufficiently in the second part of my lecture and also here. Without realizing in Russia itself that Russia's economy is only that of a medium-sized European country, Russia cannot be accepted in Europe. Although the population of Russia, as I already mentioned, is significantly less than twice the population of Germany. And finally, the size of the territory is not a criterion of a superpower like, for example, Canada, the second country in the world by country size, does not describe itself as a superpower. I have also said a lot about lying as part of the Soviet system and its resumption or continuation from the year 2000 on in Russia. Here too, the leadership layer of Russia follows the teachings, in quotation marks, of George Orwell. Who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future. In my opinion, the heroic Marina Ovsyannikova provided the confirmation of the systematic lying of the leadership layer of Russia as she protested the propaganda in the prime time news program of the state television of Russia. The text on the poster reads, "Stop the war. Don't believe the propaganda. Here they lie to you." Typical examples of the twisting of facts in a dystopian society in Orwell's book 1984 are: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. As an example of this distortion by the contemporary leadership layer of Russia, consider the following public statement in contemporary Russia. The prohibition as a legal norm is the perfect human right. Because what is the law? That is man's greatest lack of freedom. I can tell you that the more rights we will have, the less freedom. These statements reflect the distortion of terms and propaganda spread by the current leadership layer of Russia. If you remember, I already mentioned in the first part of the lecture that my goal was to convince my students that not everything that is in Russia is the best in the world. I also pointed out in the first part of the lecture that the flow of innovation is very one-sided. It runs from the west towards Russia. That was immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Russian Federation after 1991. A lot of time has passed since then, and the people of Russia got to know many other countries after the Iron Curtain was abolished. However, economic and social development, for example in education and healthcare, is held back by the political system created by the leadership layer of Russia. This is also confirmed by a member of the Academy of Sciences of Russia in a public lecture. He said, "We must tell the truth. The chief sin we always have is self-praise, self-deception, self-admiration. This is the path to degradation. We must prevent leaders from praising themselves." Mr. Nigmatulin also complains that in the past 10 years, development in all areas of society in Russia has come to a standstill. There is no progress to be seen anywhere. He laments that key positions in the country are held by the uneducated. Russia would have no future with such cadres. He also said, in a very interesting comparison, that before there was the dictatorship of the proletariat, now in Russia there is the dictatorship of the uneducated, stupid officialdom. I can also confirm the nepotism from my own experience. On the chair at the Faculty of Economics of the State University in St. Petersburg, where I worked, father and son worked together as teachers. The toleration or even promotion of harmful selection criteria by the leadership layer of Russia is another aspect on the way to the degradation of society. In contrast, as a visiting scholar from Berlin in the United States in 1986, I learned, for example, that the universities there cannot hire anyone who has a doctorate from the same university. Mr. Nigmatulin's statements also fit into the larger picture of George Orwell's dystopian society. Here are two paraphrased statements attributed to Orwell. The further society moves away from the truth, the more it hates those who speak it. Even when the truth is inconvenient or disturbing, bringing it out into the open is vital for a society to be edifying and just in the long term. And there are other similarities in contemporary Russia to Orwell's elaborations of a dystopian society. For example, with the daily rewriting of history by the Ministry of Truth in the Orwellian book. In recent years, there have been and are currently similar initiatives in Russia, especially in the field of school books. Dear compatriots in Russia and dear German fellow citizens, in the context of a lecture, I cannot list and justify all the aspects that stand in the way of rapprochement between Russia and Europe. I have listed the elements that I judge to be the most important based on my personal practical experience. But I also have countless other practical incidents, both in Russia and in other countries, that have shaped my views. Before concluding, however, I offer my unequivocal opinion on the current war in Europe. The situation with the attack on Ukraine is actually so clear that there is no need for lengthy arguments. The only just and sustainable path to peace is the termination of combat operations on side of Russia, the withdrawal of the Army of Russia from all territories of Ukraine, including Crimea, the beginning of negotiations on reparations payments from Russia to Ukraine. And now follows my final summary. I will not read it. You can pause the video for your individually needed reading time. Thank you for your attention.